Akedah Project.
We invite you to join.
One story, many angles.
Come learn with us.
Source critics like myself have divided up the Pentateuch, the Torah, into originally independent literary compositions. And we've done this because the text as we receive it as a whole is full of duplications and contradictions and discontinuities such that it doesn't read like conventional literature. A theorist like Benjamin Harshav, for example, has talked about the idea of an internal field of reference, where a piece of literature is accountable to itself, such that if it raises an issue, it needs to follow up on it. If a character knows a certain data point, then we expect that character to continue to know that data, unless there's an explanation for why it's forgotten, etc. And so when we look at the Pentateuch as it's received, we see that there are all kinds of contradictions, discontinuities, problems within the text that suggest to us that what we have is not a single authored composition, not a work, but instead a compilation. And what scholars did was they started distinguishing these duplications, discontinuities, contradictions from each other. And what they realized was that once they started doing that distinction, they could actually line up certain material, because what it did have was this internal field of reference, so that one particular set of differences seemed to line up and create a chronologically ordered plot line. And another one did the same thing, and another one did the same thing. And lo and behold, there were four main independent works that seemed to stand behind the compiled Pentateuch. And then, of course, the question is, how did they get put together? And the answer seems to be that there was a single method of compilation, and it worked according to a few basic principles. So first, it seems that in this compilation, there was maximal preservation of the underlying source material. So whoever was doing this seemed to be trying not to cut things out, but instead to preserve everything that was there. The second principle, and each of these principles is really only implicit within the text. It's not like we got a list of these principles written somewhere. The second principle was minimal intervention. We find very little that when we do this separation of this material, it seems that there's very little that can be assigned to the person compiling the material itself. So very little was added, subtracted. And then the third principle was chronological arrangement or sequential ordering of a single plot line. And so what this probably looked like, although we don't know for sure, was somebody, and because there's one method of compilation here, I'm going with the assumption that there's one compiler, although there could be many more who are working just with the same principles. But this one person seems to have had a scroll in front of him and was working with these originally independent compositions on, say, different scrolls, and was thinking all the time as he was copying, what comes next? What comes next in the story? What comes next? And with these principles of maximal preservation, minimal intervention, he's trying to keep everything, and he's trying to switch sources as little as possible. He's trying to be minimally interventionist. And so I guess probably what happened was that there was a whole bunch of planning that went into this process ahead of time. We don't have the outlining, the work product of this procedure, but it looks like a single method of compilation across the entire Torah. And for that reason, the simplest explanation here is that we have a single compiler who is responsible for most of this material. It looks like the answer is no. They didn't all have stories about Abraham. It looks like 3 of them did, and 1 of them didn't. That is the D source, what is most of the scroll of Deuteronomy. But that source knew about Abraham traditions. It just didn't recount its own version of them. In these other sources, what we call the J source, the Yahwistic source, the E source, the Elohistic source, and the P source, or the priestly source, they all appear in Genesis, in the scroll of Genesis. And what we have there is they're interwoven stories of Abraham as well as the other patriarchs, Joseph. Among those sources, we only have one account of the Akedah. It's in the Elohistic source, the E source. The P source and the J source seem to know nothing of this tradition of the near sacrifice of Isaac. It looks like there might be a little bit of material that's been added at the end of the story. People get excited about the second speech that we have from the angel at the end of the story. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is that we have a lot of usage of the Tetragrammaton, the divine name, in that section. And one of the ways that people have thought about the distinction of these sources historically, at least in the modern period when this has been taking place, is that the different sources use different divine names. And that's really partially true, but not entirely. Sometimes people think about the division of these sources or their separation from each other on the basis of these divine names. This isn't simply a stylistic difference. Instead, you can think about these as larger narrative or literary claims, even historical claims within the story worlds that are being described. So that, again, if we're talking about that internal field of reference, why would you know this deity by one name and not by another name? And why would you switch back and forth without any explanation? And in fact, when we get to Exodus, we actually have explanations. The best explanation is in P in Exodus 6, where the claim is made, we used to call him this, but now we call him that. And so that's the kind of explanation that you would expect within a single composition to make sense of that issue within an internal field of reference. What we have in Genesis is switching back and forth without any explanation. And so in Genesis 22, we get a few of these instances of the usage of the Tetragrammaton. And so people have said, well, that can't be E because E doesn't introduce the divine name Yahweh until Exodus chapter 3. This is a little bit more complicated than that for a couple of reasons. One, it's not entirely clear that that's what that Exodus 3 story is about. The Exodus 6 story is much clearer. Sometimes I think people understand Exodus 3 in light of Exodus 6. It's not necessarily the case. But it's also the case that when we look at the manuscript traditions, we have some variation in the preservation of divine names within the manuscript. So when we look at the oldest Hebrew manuscripts, certainly when we look at early translations like the Septuagint, we see that sometimes they would switch back and forth between divine names, and you can imagine how this would take place. If somebody is copying a scroll, they might be doing it based on, looking at a particular text. They might be doing it by memory. Some of these are probably memory variants where we have a switch, say in the Greek of Genesis 15, between kurios, Lord, and theos, God. That happens back and forth when we compare the Septuagint of Genesis 15 with the Masoretic text. We see that they preserve different divine names or titles in different places. So relying on those divine names is something that I think is generally not a good approach to separating this material. What we see is that some of that distinction does play out, but it's not a reliable indicator for separating sources. I think potentially, yes. The reason I say that is when you look at a story like the Akedah, situating it within its larger story, within the larger narrative in which it appears, can help identify particular points of emphasis that might not be recognized as such, or might not be contextualized in the same way if one reads simply these 19 verses. And of course, that's the way that the Akedah has oftentimes been read. It's been read as the Akedah, not as one episode within a much larger story. So, when we talked initially about doing this video, you said, we're doing this on the Akedah. We could talk about this source critically. I thought, well, the Akedah is actually not all that important in E. The E story is much larger. It has other points of emphasis. But it is the case, too, that the Genesis 22 story typifies certain concerns, theological concerns, of the E source, which are interesting. So in Genesis 15, which also belongs to E, we have Abraham credited for his trust in God, his belief. This is credited to him as his righteousness. And then we get this test here in Genesis 22. And when Abraham passes the test, when he demonstrates his loyalty, his fidelity to the deity, even in the face of a very reasonable, self-interested kind of choice that he could have made, the response is, now I know that you really fear God. And that's actually a theme that keeps coming up over and over again in the E source. We have this concern for the fear of God. We also have a concern for loyalty to the Israelite God. So in Exodus chapter 1, for example, we have the story of the midwives, and that also belongs to E. And there, the midwives are credited with fearing God. And this is a passage that people have puzzled over because these are Egyptians. Do they even know the Israelite God? How is it that they would have feared that God? And so there's all kinds of interpretive history on this point. What I would suggest is that what's going on there is actually not so different than what we have in Genesis 22. That is, there's a concern for transcending self-interest. Do the midwives actually know the Israelite God, and are they Yahweh worshipers, Elohim worshipers? The text doesn't say that, and it's actually a little bit difficult to imagine that as a possibility. The same thing applies to a text like Genesis 20, with the story of the wife-sister story with Abimelech of Gerar. There, Abraham is worried because the people in Gerar aren't fearers of God. And so he thinks that they're going to act in an untoward way. And there too, the concern seems to be self-interest. Like, how would they behave? They would behave in a self-interested way. They aren't fearers of God. Interestingly, when we get to a text like the D source knows the E source and borrows from it, rewrites it. One of the stories that it rewrites from E is the story of the battle with Amalek. So in Exodus 17, we have the E account of Amalek attacking Israel when they're vulnerable in the wilderness. And when D rewrites this story, it accuses Amalek of not fearing God. And this seems to be an interpretation of the E story along the lines of E's theology. This idea that what they've done is an outrage because they've only served themselves. They've only been concerned about their own interest and not that of others. And so when you set a text like Genesis 22 and its theological emphases in the context of this larger composition, different sort of elements come to light. And so in that sense, I could imagine somebody saying, this is really relevant for contemporary readers, contemporary religious readers.